So, hello everybody, and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. You're going to have to forgive me. I'm going to give some advance warning. This is the first podcast I've ever done with two people on it. We're going to be testing my hosting skills today. So, today's podcast is all going to be about the concept of value, what it is, how do we communicate it, how do we help other people within the organization understand it, because we know that there's a huge amount of change going on in finance right now, and being able to talk about why we need to make that shift, and how important it is really valuable. With me today to talk to us about the concept of value and how we communicate it is Tim Barber. So Tim is a visiting fellow at Hull University. Welcome, Tim. Lovely to have you on the show.
Thanks, Hannah.
And we've also got Clive Webb. So Clive has been on a number of podcasts with me. He's an experienced hand now. So hopefully you guys will be recognizing his voice. But for those that perhaps haven't listened to a previous episode, you really, really should, by the way. Clive Webb is Head of Business Management at the ACCA. So welcome, Clive.
Hi, Hannah. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so as you'll see, I am still getting used to this multiple people on a podcast situation. So actually, as I do with all my podcasts, I would like to start with a bit of intro. So Tim, would you like to tell us a little bit about your background and what you've been doing over the last couple of years?
Indeed. Thanks very much. So I think I spent most of my career in the consulting arena. Prior to becoming a consultant, I spent a number of years working in the world of logistics and the supply chain and home delivery and that type of thing. And then across my sort of consulting career, I've worked globally. But two things to note really in terms of the question. I spent a couple of years as the global lead for value management for KPMG. And that was really on the management consulting side, and that was looking at the question of how to understand and measure value in transformation projects. Okay, and then to roll that out globally across the whole of the business. In my previous job, it was to set up an advisory practice within a organisation called KBR, a global organisation working in government and defence and space. But as KBR in the UK are a strategic supplier to the government, and as such had to make sure it was responding to the government's agenda on introducing social value into all government contracts. So I was the executive sponsor for how that was introduced into the business and introduced into all of our projects. So I come at this from a perspective of having been thinking about value and value management, both from a consulting perspective and then from a how do we do it in a business perspective.
Yeah, so lots of different angles as well. So yeah, really, really interesting, and we will dig into that in a little bit. So, and then over Clive, for those that haven't listened to one of your awesome podcasts, do you want to tell us a bit about your role at the ACCA?
Okay, so my role is basically research around anything to do with finance, the finance function, and the role of the CFO or the domain of the CFO. So that can go from technology through to the future of the function, through to skills, and transformation is part of that, which is where Tim and I have previously had conversations many times over many years about value and the concept of value, which will underpin, I think, what we're talking about today.
Brilliant. So if we set the scene, perhaps, because we've done a lot of podcasts, you and I, Clive, on what is the change that's needed. So could you just set the scene for those that perhaps are new to the podcast and haven't heard that history? What is the change that we're looking for in finance at the moment in particular?
Okay. I think finance functions are the minute, and we're talking at a time when inflation is at a very high level, costs are getting out of control, supply chains, Tim mentioned those a moment or two ago, are increasingly getting challenged. So finance, I think, is going through a change in probably two dimensions. One, playing that strategic role that we saw during the pandemic of being the advisors helping the business understand where the possibility of the future actually lies. And I don't think there's one probable finite view of where that business might be. But then it's also grounding it in what an organization actually stands for. And I think from conversations with CFOs we've been having recently, this concept of purpose and the value to society, which links into Tim's area, is absolutely paramount, because we can't cut costs in the way we responded to inflation in previous times. We've got to think about what is the purpose of the organization, where does it deliver value, how does it create sustainable organizations going forwards. And that, I think, is the role of the finance function and how it's starting to evolve. So that's really about having more data, having about the technology and the systems to support that, having the people with the necessary skills, the extended business partners we talked about before, and bringing that together in how do we advise and help organizations navigate this incredibly challenging time.
No, absolutely. And all of those things that you just mentioned, whether that's technology, whether that's skills, that all takes investment, doesn't it? And that's one of the hardest conversations to have, particularly at a time of rising costs, of inflation, and this volatile piece. So I think that is maybe one of the more interesting angles, is how do we talk about the value that investment's going to bring. So, but before we get into the detail of actually relating it specifically to finance, I think one of the questions I wanted to ask Tim is, how do we define value? What is it? And how would we, before we get into how we measure it and how we understand it, can you give us a definition of how you see value?
Yeah, I was going to say it depends on who you talk to, but let you go. Let's go with my definition or view on value. And I think what's really interesting is linking it back to what Clive said about the changing purpose and strategy of organisations, because my view has always been that is the strategy and the purpose drives everything, and it drives what the finance function should be doing. And I think what we're seeing is, for organisations, is moving away from a view of just financial value or economic value. And that has been by and large the driving force. If you take a primary purpose of organisations having been to maximise return to shareholders, then you take a very economic value of that. And from a finance perspective, and I say all of this from the perspective of not being an accountant. Okay, so but I think in that it's about how do you use the accounting guidance to add the numbers up and demonstrate the economic value. The world is very much shifting to having to take a position on environmental value, everything that's going on in the world and the challenges that we face there, and how we manage and improve the impact on the environment. But I think also the other element is social value. So in terms of the relationship with communities, with customers, on jobs, skills, and all of those types of things. So I think the world is moving from just what's the economic / financial value to we need to consider what the environmental value and the social value is at the same time. And I would just use those sort of three buckets of value as what organisations need to start to focus on, and indeed are starting to focus on.
Yeah, because it's an interesting one. The economic value piece in itself is actually more complex than you might think, isn't it? Because it's obviously returning back to profit, but that profit could be made up of anticipatory changes that you're making as part of whatever transformation you're going through. So, for instance, it could be, what is the value that your finance team could bring to the organization from a financial perspective if they had better business partnering skills, as an example. So I guess if we look at it with those three types of value, It's interesting, isn't it, that we've got a way to measure value in almost three different ways. And then within that, there are complexities about how to actually identify the value that's being given by the transformation. So, out of interest, when you were in obviously your management consulting days and you're having to talk
Yeah.
about this, how did you structure even the economic value identification? Was there a process that you went through?
There was. And one of the challenges in an accountancy business and then into the business world was, firstly trying to shift people's thinking away from just economic value to considering environmental and social at the same time. But I do think from an economic perspective, yeah, absolutely, it's quite a complex picture in the way that you identify what you're trying to achieve through the strategy and the purpose. And then underneath that, you find the measures of being able to understand what you want to do. And part of the work I'm looking to do with the University of Hull is really to look at that broader complexity, because what an organization is doing on its own and it's the way that it operates is one question. But where it gets really interesting when it comes to the question of value is, how do you multiply the value that you're providing externally as an organization? Okay, there's certain things you can do on your own in the way that you operate on your own. But actually, if you then start to operate differently in the local environment that you're working within, and you do it in alignment with some maybe other public sector or private sector organizations, you can get much greater value by working together. If you start to align that with what you're trying to achieve nationally, in terms of maybe skills agenda or productivity agendas or whatever it is, then again you get another multiplier effect. So in thinking about the externals in this, there's the question of, well, what can an organization just do on its own, and what can it achieve on its own? But actually, what can it do if it starts to work with others in either the local or national scene, and really start to multiply the value that they provide in taking a much more of a leadership approach. So I don't want to pretend that any of this is easy, or that any of this is set in the way that you need to do it. I think the point is, you need to think about it very hard, and you need to decide as an organization on what your purpose is when it comes to these different types of value. Are you just going to comply with the regulations? Are you going to make the effort to manage the value that you're providing? Or are you going to take a leadership role in the way that you think about it and where you look for the opportunities to take a much bigger role, either locally or nationally, to really generate additional value in the way that you work? And there's, to take a slightly academic perspective, I'm not particularly an academic either, but there's a really interesting book that was published about 10 years ago called The 9 Visions of Capitalism, Unlocking the Meaning of Wealth Creation. It's by Charles Hamden Turner of Fons Trompenas. Okay, and it's an interesting book, but right at the beginning, they make the distinction in terms of saying there is a difference between making money and creating wealth. And I think that wealth you can take as being of value. So, I think typically organizations, certainly in the Western world, have been driven by making money and maximizing the returns to shareholders as a single body of people. When you get into the question of creating value or creating wealth, that's much more about, how do I work with others to actually generate as much wealth or value as I can. Now, if you take that back to the the impact on the finance organisation, and the finance organisation should absolutely be driven by that external purpose. Well, you're doing very different things. If it's just about maximising return, as I said before, it's about, okay, let's use the accounting regulations and add things up and generate the most returns to shareholders. But creating value, you've really have got to think about, how do I do things differently? How do I make better decisions? And how do I understand the impact of those decisions on, the broader definition of value, whether it be environmental or social, in the way that it goes?
And obviously, Clive, you're speaking to a lot of CFOs as part of your day job managing the research. What are some of the conversations that you're having with CFOs about value and the need for change? Is it a conversation that comes up a lot?
I think it's a conversation that's starting to happen more and more. And as Tim has alluded to, it's connected with the E and the S in that agenda. And I think there's a realization starting that it isn't simply about that financial return that Tim talked about. The stakeholder community is more and more interested in the things that Tim's been talking about. And as a society, giving back and promoting sustainability, they're becoming core to what we do. So it's not simply, you talked earlier on, Hannah, I think, about investment. It's not simply about investment being measured in that traditional return on investment type argument. It's what are all these other things that it does, and how do we sustain our role in the community? And I think during the pandemic, we started to see organizations think about, well, actually, how do I change my strategy to support the community I'm in? And it might be, for example, one here of a business moving towards more local provision of food. But that then ripples out into other environmental aspects, etc., etc. So they're starting to have those conversations. They're starting to realize. But I think one of the catalysts from some of the CFOs we've been talking to, this sense of how does this business survive in this challenging inflationary time, has to come back to all the things Tim said. So where does it add value to society? And it simply isn't about that pure cost driver anymore, because that isn't the totality of why organizations exist. So we're starting to see that change, and it's a journey that I think we're probably on, and it may well be a journey that's accelerated by the current economic climate. So
Yeah, and I think
go on,
it's
Tim.
yeah, I think that's a good point. I think it's a good point to describe it as a journey, because said before, this is quite complex in the way that it needs to work going forward, and there are no easy solutions to it, and organisations need to go on this journey to really start to think very hard about how they do make decisions and how they do make investments and how they judge investments and options within them, because it is now going to be very different than the way that it was before. And that then rolls back into the role of the finance organisation in terms of making sense of the potential value that can be generated, and articulating that in the options and the business case and the investment case in the way that it goes. But also then making sure that once that investment has been implemented, what actually happened? What was the actual value that was generated? How does that differ to what was assumed in the business case going forward? And how do organisations learn from that so that they can feed what they're actually generating back into the next business case, and it becomes much as much a learning organisation as anything else.
And I think that's a really interesting concept about the concept of a business case in itself, isn't it? In that business case that we would normally put forwards with any new investment, that's going to look very different over the next few years than it has done previously, potentially, because it's got to contain those additional elements of not just the economic value, but also the social and the environmental piece as well. Um, and and I think on that, that's an interesting piece, because when I've spoken to CFOs in the past, they've struggled to put together the economic case for some of these changes. So, how would, what are the sort of the skills, and how can we approach the putting together of that business case to actually deliver something that, is covering all three of those elements?
From my perspective, a business case is a compelling narrative supported by evidence. So the first question is, what's the narrative that supports or justifies what you're trying to do with that, and thinking quite clearly, through that narrative in all of its aspects. So let's maybe try and run with an example, and it'll be imperfect, but let's see how we go. So let's look at the replacement of a vehicle fleet. Okay. I think traditionally that would be done on the basis of what's the purchase price, and and take some account of what are the running costs in doing that. Okay, and that's all fine, and I think you can decide on what you want it to do, what's the best fit, what's it cost, how much is it going to cost to run it, and let's make a decision on that basis. And organisations are quite used to doing that. If you now decide that you want to buy a vehicle fleet which is based on renewables, whether that be electric or hydrogen or whatever it is, then you've got an interesting start point, because you've got to consider the purchase price and the potential difference in the running costs as against buying a traditional combustion engine vehicle, and that relationship is very different in that the running costs are much lower and purchase price might be slightly higher. So you've got to be clear that you might be doing a bit of invest to save in the upfront costs, but there'll be a very good return, that's sort of fine. But then you could sort of take that slightly further and say, well, we're going to buy an electric fleet of vans, delivery vans. Okay, and that's where we're going, and lots of organisations are starting to do that. We've got some space, maybe it is in a field next door or on the roof, so we're going to buy some solar panels so that we can start to generate our own electricity to power the vehicles. In buying those solar panels, you've got to be very careful from an environmental perspective, a supply chain perspective, and an ethical perspective, that you're buying those from the right place, all the way down the supply chain, whether it be in the assembly or whether in the manufacture of the materials that go into it. So there's, that you're comfortable that it's an ethical decision in the way that you're going. You can then look to take the example. You look to put them on the factory roof and install them there, and you might then make the decision that you're going to buy some storage batteries that go with that, so that you can store the electricity out of hours of sunlight, so that you can recharge the vehicles overnight when they come back in. Okay, so that adds to the business case in terms of going, okay, well, that's the economics a bit different, and I'm building this case out. But then you can get to the point of saying, okay, we can put more solar panels on the roof than we actually need. So we're going to be generating excess electricity. So what do we do with that electricity that we're generating? We could send it back to the grid, or we could decide that we're going to use that locally, that we're going to use that excess electricity to support the sports club that's next door, the hospital that's down the road. So what you're starting to build out there is a business case where you're considering what's the economic value of buying the electric vehicles, and how do we build that out in terms of generating our own electricity at the same time? What's the environmental impact of doing that? And making sure we're ethical, but also what do we say because we're not taking electricity from the grid, that's generating it ourselves. And then you get into the social question of actually we could use that surplus electricity to have a great social impact out in the local economy. So, I think, that as an example is sort of saying, there's one way of making that decision today. There's a very different way of making that decision as you go forward, because you're looking to balance the economic, the environmental, and the social impact of what you could do. And there are sort of many decisions in all of that. Up front, do I buy combustion engine or electric? Secondly, do I put solar generation or even wind turbine generation where I am? And then actually, do I generate more than I can to do the social element as well?
And there's an interesting piece in that, isn't it? Because there is a skill set in identifying the opportunity that one decision that started off as an economic one around needing new vehicles, which you need to do, and the ability to expand that out to encompass both the environmental and I think the social in itself is a bit harder, isn't it? Because if we think back to the skills, Clive, of that business partner, that skill set to be able to sit down with the the head of operations that's come to you in finance, said at some point we're going to need new vehicles because of A, Y, and Z, and to be able to expand that out across other departments and to fall in line with the purpose, that's a big stretch. And so I don't think it's something that most experienced business partners are necessarily doing at the moment.
No, and I think you're probably right, and I think it goes back to that level of understanding of the business model, but also that argument that Tim eloquently put together there of how these bits start to fit together in terms of society, in terms of the purpose of the organisation. But there's also the need to have the ability to back it up with some elements of data. What's the carbon offset if we do action X or action Y? Where do I get that data from to make that visible case? And you're right, that skill set is becoming far broader, but it comes back to a core understanding of the business, the purpose of the business, an alignment to what the organisation is seeking to do. Because as Tim said in his example, that's as much driven about the attitude of the organisation to society as it is to the pure financial benefit. And that's a mindset shift. I think we're likely to see with some of the disclosure requirements that are being talked about, some of that shift also being embedded in some of the things that the finance professional needs to think about, from the attitude of actually we need to report on some of these aspects and dimensions. So that increasingly becomes embedded. I think the skill that Tim highlighted there is turning what is a compliance reporting type perspective into a value and purpose type perspective, and how does that equate to the benefit to society and the purpose of the organization. And you're right, it is a step change, but it's a step change I think we're all probably going to need to start seeing, because we're going to have to report on some of this stuff either as a tier 1 or a tier 2 or a tier 3 supplier. We get caught in the chain, but it's understanding how we turn that into a benefit to the organization, but also we start recording the data in the right way to support, as Tim said, you've got your business case, but you need to monitor the outcome of that business case as it incrementally occurs over time. And one conversation Tim and I have had quite a few occasions is your business case is not just finite, it continues to evolve, and you monitor it in a value way on an ongoing basis. It's not just we approve at the start, we measure it hopefully at the end. We measure on a continual basis. I don't know if you want to say anything about that bit, Tim.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really important when we talk about business cases to get away from the business case being a document that you write, somebody signs it off, and you put it in a cupboard, and it is never referred to again. To one that is being live. That's what we said up front in the business case. Now, how are we performing against what we said? Were we right in the assumptions we made on carbon offset, or in the ongoing, maintenance costs of those vehicles? What's changing? And just making sure that you're always in a position to say, actually, in that business case we put forward and we signed off as an investment case, was it right? Was it too optimistic? Was it too pessimistic? Was it, bang on the money? Because you need to be able to take all of that knowledge and learning into your next business cases. So you've got confidence in what you're, in the decisions that you're making, the investments that you're putting forward. But you're also challenging yourself in terms of how bold you want to be in your business case. You might, decide as a business that, to go back to that example, that you're happy in the bit of the decision that says we're going to go electric, but you're not quite sure about the solar panels side of things. And so you could decide you're just going to buy an electric fleet, and then you're just going to put some charges in the factory, and away you go. You won't take it from the grid. But once you've got confidence in the fact it all works, then you might revisit that and come back and say, now I do want to put solar panels on, or I want to put a wind turbine in, and I want to generate my own, because is it the next set of value I can take? And sometimes in these things, because things are changing quite quickly, it's about how do you build the confidence in yourself, in your organization, to make the change, and then make the next change, and then make the step beyond that. So you might decide in that business case, you're going to do everything. You're going to do the electric fleet, you're going to buy the solar panels, and you're going to provide the surplus to the local hospital. And that's, you're going to generate some great value, and you're going to generate a great narrative about what you're doing as an organization. But then you might sort of say, well, actually, now the really difficult bit beyond that is, how do I work with the large organization next door to see if they can do the same, so that we can combine what we're generating from solar and actually start to put more into the surplus electricity into the local economy, in the way that we might start meeting some of the fuel poverty that is being seen in certain elements of the population. So I think it needs to be kept live, so you can step through the options that you've got. You don't need to do everything at once. You can do the option that gives you the most confidence and gets the organisation to make the step forward, but keep stepping forward. And to do that, it comes back to the business case, the investment decision, making the next one, and having that clear path through. And I just think that's really important, because absolutely, I've always found the way is, you have the business case, you sign it off, you put it in the cupboard, you never refer to it again, and you never learn anything. And that's not the world that we're operating in at the moment. And I think, Hannah, your point, or question to Clive about, well, that's a challenge to the finance organisation or to the finance business partner. Absolutely. But my question is, in a business, who else is going to do it? If it's not the finance department who's going to do this, who is? And the reality is, there isn't anybody else to do this. Now, there are some real challenges in then saying, okay, how do I get the data to just, the operational data or the economic data justify my decision? how do I then work out what is the carbon offset or the carbon savings that I'm making, and how do I then measure that as I go through and keep on top of it? How do I measure the social impact of supplying electricity into the local economy? Well, that's really hard, but you've got to think about it. You don't necessarily have to solve it today, but you've got to think about it and work it through. And all of these sort of skill sets have got to come from somewhere. And, thinking about decisions and the value that's coming from it is different to just what's the money. You can count money. I know it's not that simple, but you can count money. But how you measure generating value, that's a different skill set, a different level of analysis, a different presentation of options in business cases, a different set of decisions to be made. And all of that has to come from someplace, and I don't see it really coming from anywhere but the finance organisation.
I think there's also an interesting piece. If I can challenge, I fully support a value-driven mindset when it comes to business. For me, and purpose is a really key part of how I think about our business and how we work. But for those that have, if you think about a lot of them that are PE-backed, that have heavy investment and are heavily led with the finance and the stakeholder return conversation, isn't there an argument to say even that social and environmental value needs to be brought back to an economic value conversation? Because, for instance, if we just take the environmental piece, if you don't understand your carbon footprint, if you don't drive that piece, you're actually risking the business for when legislation comes in that requires you to do so. Because let's be honest, a lot of the changes that we're seeing are because legislation is developing and being enforced around reporting around ESG. Standards are now existing and that side of things. So, that I really do support the whole piece around identifying social and environmental value. But is there then a step that goes next to say, but this is why we should measure this and why this is important to us as a business?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think this is a case of, we either do the economic or we do the environment and the social. We need to do all three. And we need to find the balance in all three. And that's, the balance that needs to be represented in the investment decision. And government and organisations and businesses will always want to find a way of trying to translate it back to an economic value, and there will be all sorts of ways of doing that and using proxy measures and all of that type of stuff. And you will always want to do that. You have to be absolutely careful in the way that you do that. So in my previous organisation, as I said, I was the exec sponsor for social value. And we did, one of the first things we did was, we had a number of large contracts with government, was to bring in an organisation to say, what's the social value that we generate from the contracts that we have with government? Okay. And they did a really nice piece of work and did all the calculations, and they came back and we worked out that we were generating £2 of social value for every pound we spent on behalf of the government. And that came to a really quite large figure. And there's always a danger at that point of then going down the rabbit hole of, well, how did you calculate that number? Is that calculation correct? Is there a different way of doing it? And there is a whole debate in here about that says, how do you translate environmental and social value into quantitative economic measures? And that's really quite tricky to do, and anybody can pick holes in it if they want to, and the like. And you've got to find that balance between, the quantitative and the qualitative in what you're doing. But but you do have to find ways of measuring all of these things, and get the balance. So I'm not sure whether that answers your question, but they're all there to be balanced, and they're all there to be considered, and absolutely on time. On occasions, the economic part of the argument will carry more weight than the other elements. But as an interesting example, to go back to the UK government and the way that it's starting to change its procurement. Procurement has typically been on quality and price, and some element of other elements. The UK government is coming in and saying, well, actually, in all contracts going out, we want to have a percentage of the evaluation criteria to be based on social value. Initially, they'll come out and say it might be 5% we want social value, but actually, the aspiration may well be for 30% of the contract evaluation to be based on social value. And at that point, you're getting into a really interesting place that says, if you're bidding into government as, we can do a really good service in terms of quality at a good price and still absolutely lose on social value. Well, at that point, you've got to pay attention to what you're doing. And certainly in my previous life, you talk about social value to an organisation and they all look at you and go, yeah, whatever. Go and do your tree hugging somewhere else. If you say it's going to be 30% of the evaluation going forward, and if we don't address it, we're not going to have a business, then you get a slightly different reaction in what you're doing.
And that's a really interesting point, because I think it is the fact that social environmental value is actually tied back to economics. If you think the drive from consumers and even employees these days around their organization, they want consumers want the organization to have an environmental status. They don't want to consume goods or buy goods from an organization that's seen as evil or nasty. Yeah, if you think about some of the news stories that have come out over the last few years, there's a brand issue if you have a bad connection with societal and environmental value. There's also in the employee conversation, isn't there? Like, employees want to work for organizations that hold purpose at the heart of what they do. And also they are looking
Absolutely.
at the societal and environmental impact of a lot of the organizations they're working with, which then, given the current recruitment issue, I think I saw in the latest news that unemployment is being outpaced by the number of vacancies available on the news. So we're in that employee retention piece. So that, like you say, Tim, I think what's really exciting for me personally is that actually those two have an economic impact, and you can, and demonstrate that the hard thing is justifying and connecting the dots on that economic impact.
Absolutely, and it's all new, and it's all challenging, and it's complex, and it's really exciting at the same time. And it's come back to that point you make about the talent that you need to have in the finance area to be able to address all of these things. You need, super smart people who can think their way through some quite complex issues. But to be attractive to those types of finance professionals, then they are going to make a judgment of what do they think about you as an organisation. And that's going to be based on, what are you doing environmentally? What are you doing for the local community, for the country? And what are you dealing with? It's not good enough anymore to be able to attract people simply on, salary. They're looking for, a much broader, positive place to work. Certainly, in my previous job, the fact that we were focused on social value, we were looking to take a leadership role in really pushing it as far as we could. And we were working on some key environmental issues. It was a very attractive place to start to attract people into. So I my assumption in all of this is people want to do interesting work in an organisation they admire, and there's and they will make their decisions on that basis.
And I think if I just flip it back, perhaps, Clive, to what we've talked about previously, is that we're talking very much in identifying across the wider business the value across environmental, social, and economic. But actually, and finance obviously has a key part to play in that role. But if we flip it and look internally at finance, there's quite a few challenges in getting. I often find is that finance almost tends to get last to the last part of the investment cycle, in terms of their skills, in terms of their systems and their technologies. So, how do we address this and shift that conversation forward? And is that something you're seeing and experiencing, based on your conversations?
I think Tim said it earlier on. If this doesn't reside in finance, where does it reside? So I think that's part of this discussion. So it is a question of how do we grow the skills to be able to understand this narrative, because it isn't going to exist anywhere else. And I think it links back, Hannah, to something that we started this podcast with, which is, so where are the CFOs at the moment? And the answer is trying to work out how to manage in an exceptionally changing time. But actually, it comes back to this value and purpose of what the organization is. So finance needs to align to, if you like, that purpose, if I can not mix my metaphors, as it were. And therefore, it needs to upskill in understanding some of the things Tim has talked about, particularly at the business partner level. And at the finance director level, CFO level, understanding these concepts of value and what it means to society and how that links to all the other things we've been talking about retention, about economic journeys, about environmental journeys. And you mentioned earlier on about private equity funded organizations. We're starting to hear the conversation move away from pure financial return. Yes, the private equity house wants to get its buyout, but it's not going to do it at the cost of an organization that doesn't also have that environmental and social track. So this is becoming increasingly important, and how you measure that and how you communicate that measurement and how, as Tim said, you build it into your decision making start to become absolutely fundamental to the finance function. And I think that is starting to be appreciated by CFOs, but we're on a journey. And hopefully this podcast has encouraged people to start that journey themselves.
Absolutely, because there's layers within layers, and perhaps a topic for another podcast. But if we even thinking of environmental value within environmental, there's like we talked about the stakeholder impact across employees, across legislation, across customers, across the supply chain. Right, there's all of these lenses in which we need to look across that value piece. And yes, but I have realized that we have run out of time on today's podcast. So, but it has been absolutely fascinating. I think a really unique perspective, Tim, on what the role of finance could look like and that value-based skill set. We talk a lot about business partnering, don't we, Clive? But we don't necessarily always talk about like the next step for business partnering itself. We just want to get to the finance business partner, and actually, like you say, it's a value partner, helping the business to identify where to go. So thank you to you both, and I loved the viewpoints you both had and how you connected the dots for our audience and hopefully inspired a few interesting conversations within. So thank you, Tim. Thank you, Clive. And of course, if any, I will pop in the links in the show notes to both Clive and Tim's profile. And out of if anyone's listened to this and like actually would like more topics and these are the questions I would like answered, feel free to send them through. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, send me a message. I'd love to. This could be a really interesting topic to explore. So thank you, Tim. Thank you, Clive, and thank you to our listeners for joining the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah.